welcome to Talent Hub TV episode 12. Super excited to be in Melbourne today with Paul Fayle, and we're going to run through a huge amount of different topics, background, the Salesforce ecosystem, how he got into the space, and much more. So thanks for coming, Paul.
No worries.
So yeah, I guess let's start off from the very beginning, your career before Salesforce and what you were doing, and then how you kind of got into this space.
I guess I've done a little bit of everything. Started out as a lawyer, of all things.
Yeah.
But very quickly got enticed into the world of consulting prior to the old tech bust.
Sure.
And started out more as a business analyst in that realm in consulting. From there, got shoved into a technical role, a semi-technical role, I guess. Typically a Siebel developer, so quite development focused.
Sure.
Liked it. Had no experience prior, but really liked it. Got into it and essentially went on from there. So through consulting, went client side. So I used to look after the CRM capability at a large financial institution for a while.
Sure.
From there, vendor side. So initially Oracle and then Salesforce.
Yeah.
And then back into consulting. So, which is, I guess, a natural fit for me.
Sure. Okay, great. And so prefer this space to practice in law, I take it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a lot more creativity, and I think people really underrate the creativity aspect of the job. It's all about finding solutions to problems.
Sure.
And they can be really ambiguous problems. You've got to be creative. It's not as dry, follow or paint by numbers as the legal sphere generally is.
Sure. Okay. And what's your role now? What do you do? Where has that got you to now?
Yeah, I guess so. At the moment, I'm the lead architect for the region from a Salesforce practice perspective at Deloitte Digital. I think that it means different things to different people, but in essence, I kind of provide QA and guidance to all the other architects in the Salesforce sphere, input to, I guess, the sales cycle from the point of view of solutioning for prospective clients, and then even guidance on solutioning for our existing clients as well.
Sure.
Projects.
And you haven't mentioned the title that you hold, so you've forgotten to mention the CTA so far. So I guess that's something that we should touch on.
Yes. So I am a CTA. I got that. I'm struggling for the number of years ago now, but quite some time ago now.
Yeah.
And I guess look, a lot of people in the ecosystem are pretty keen on hearing about how to achieve that.
So going back to moving from Siebel into the Salesforce world, what was the initial attraction? And at that point, did you see and expect the growth that Salesforce has had?
A little, I'll be honest. So at the time, I would consider myself an expert in Siebel at the time. And I sort of was in two minds about whether I jump ship and transition into the Salesforce space. One part of me said, well, I've built up all these expertise over the course of a decade or so. So, do I really want to start again? I think I was convinced by the platform, basically. And so what I saw was the old application space was dying, and that was actually rapidly becoming the case. And Salesforce was a very, very compelling offering. Whereas I spent most of my time in the Siebel space actually really thinking about the supporting infrastructure and spending a lot of my time on making sure the database was set up correctly, the application servers, web servers, etc. All of that goes away with Salesforce, and I saw that you could really focus on what adds value to the clients or to business by using platforms like Salesforce. And what I noticed was the speed of an innovation that they were experiencing, even back then, and I think it's even more amazing now. But even back then, was so compelling. So I think I made a very quick decision that was where I wanted to be. And yes, I was playing catch up. I was definitely playing catch up.
Sure.
Most of my contemporaries had already made that shift. but I decided to bite the bullet and retrain, basically.
And I'm guessing no regrets.
No regrets, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. So, so you talk about the innovation of the platform. How long ago was it you made that switch, and what's kind of changed? What has been the kind of innovation over that time?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting. Again, I struggle to kind of think about the years, but I'd say I've been doing this for roughly 6, maybe 7 years. And at the time that I moved into Salesforce, it was still fairly, I guess looking back, not all of it was really all there at that point. It was still largely Sales and Service Cloud. Communities were really only just coming out, switching over from the old portal structure. There was, Visualforce was a thing, but only just. It had only just kind of really taken off. S controls weren't completely dead yet. So quite a big change from that to now what we see, which is and it's no longer now just about that core Force.com platform. It's so much wider, right? You got your Commerce Cloud, your Marketing Cloud, obviously during that time, but analytics, and I could go on, right? It's such an expanding ecosystem, and the breadth of what what skills you require to kind of look at Salesforce when you term it Salesforce. It's so much more broad today.
It's not just a plug and play.
Absolutely not.
So how have projects changed over that time? Not just, I guess, adding more products, but the kind of customer that's using Salesforce now, and complexity, length, that kind of thing. Yeah,
look, it's way. I think it's evolved into being more of an enterprise consideration, and people kind of treat it as a serious part of their architecture, so of their ecosystem. So the clients before, I think they viewed Salesforce as a very quick, easy, fast-moving business and business-only solution, and IT really didn't get involved at all. And I think now all of the parts of the organisation or a client organisation will get involved.
Sure.
She'll have IT involved in terms of connecting it up and hooking it up to on-prem systems and so on and so forth. But you also have obviously still that very much that business focus. I think alongside that, alongside the scale and complexity of those implementations growing, you've also had a little bit of a maturity curve in terms of the people implementing it, and the organisations implementing it, going from a very sort of reactive, almost too agile, I'll say, just from the point of view of, you get given, you have requests coming in from the business and you just do them. And so what you end up with at the end of the day is something really organic, not necessarily great implementation. And there are a lot of those out there that, just evolved without any kind of governance and without any kind of rigor, no standards, no consistent standards, and no target state or end in sight in terms of what you want to achieve at the end of the day. So not focused necessarily on overall outcomes.
The long term, How difficult are those to fix then?
Look, it's interesting. There's two ways of looking at that. There's quite an opportunity for consultancies, for practices to go in there and remediate. But I think it can sometimes be difficult if that's a base that you're supposed to be working on, right? It can be quite limiting. So I think what it does, or what it has done, is it's really shone a bit of a spotlight on the fact that Salesforce is actually no different to anything else. You still need some checks and balances, controls. You can still hurt yourself. The ramifications of that are less in the Salesforce ecosystem versus other. You don't take 10 years to fix the problem. With multiple millions. It's generally fairly comparatively easy to fix those issues. However, I think that's again part of that maturity. People have realise that they actually need to apply some of that rigour
Sure.
to the implementations as well.
I think that's definitely something we could learn from. Even though we're a small user base, I jump in and start building workflows straight into production all the time. So something I
probably don't do that.
So obviously the platform is wide. There's lots to it now, but where do you see it continuing to grow? Like what's next?
Look, I guess what I've noticed a bit of a shift over the course of the last few years, from just simply evolving the product from a product development perspective.
Yeah.
So really focusing on sort of new aspects to again service cloud or community cloud or whatever it might be. I've noticed it evolving from that to very much more an acquisition model.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're seeing is, where it makes sense, Salesforce is acquiring organizations. So, Cloud Craze from a B2B e-commerce perspective, Demandware for B2C e-commerce, for example. But what I like is it's tempered a bit, right? So part of their strategy before was very much, respond to the community as a whole, mm-hmm. and implement the product in alignment with that. Not necessarily always driven by that, but certainly, you'll notice with every release that there are a lot of ideas
Sure.
that have been raised by, the customer base,
yeah.
that are incorporated into the release. And so that's still happening, and I think that's great. With the acquisition model that they're embarking on at the moment, what is different to some of the older, bigger IT companies, where they went through that process and started acquiring others, is that I can see that Salesforce is making a concerted effort to bring them together so that they really do provide a bit of a cohesive
Sure.
Picture.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the stuff that is sort of currently happening around that, especially around the e-commerce space, to make it a bit more of a story,
yeah.
Is great.
Okay.
And I think that's why I think that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Sure.
The acquisition.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's certainly the way that I see it evolving. And it's a different way of speeding up innovation, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
We've had some interesting discussions recently on LinkedIn about job titles, and I think it's a very confusing space at the moment because you have solution architects, technical architects, all aspiring to one day be a CTA. You were a SQL developer, but you wouldn't class yourself as a hardcore developer. Yet you're a technical architect.
No, I'm rubbish.
So, and I guess there's one angle is that you don't have to come from a development background to be a CTA. But what do you make of the whole job title thing at the moment? What's the difference between a solution architect and a technical architect? Is the CTA the right title for a technical architect now? What do you think? Yeah,
look, I mean, it's a very difficult space, but I think, I started as in Salesforce. I started as a solution architect, which is using their terminology is in the functional space.
Sure.
So more of an application architect as opposed to technical. But I think there's always a bit of a blend, right? I think the terms solution architect and technical architect, and I've commented on this before, but I don't think they're good terms.
Sure.
I think you really have to look at what space people play in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the term application architect is not a bad term. I think that's a good one for people who have a functional emphasis on the Salesforce platform.
Sure.
Primarily on the Salesforce platform.
Yeah.
For those that sort of extend past that, I actually like the term solution architect, which is a little bit counter because it's a wider industry term, and it typically has a range of from functional down to technical.
Sure.
Involved. Ultimately, there's no set definition.
Yeah.
But you're either going to be doing functionally driven solutioning.
Mm-hmm.
From a micro level right up to a macro level, or the same in the more technical space. And the technical space necessarily involves understanding and knowledge of other systems and integration and network and security and that side of things.
So a technical architect isn't necessarily the natural progression from a developer just because they've designed a solution on Salesforce?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not. And there are many other skill sets that need to come into play in terms of that space. Right?
Sure.
So from my view, a really good developer is someone who certainly does micro solutioning. So they're given a particular problem within an area and they come up with a solution. And the really good ones don't need to be told to a very granular level what they need to do.
Sure.
They'll manage to work that out and apply best practices and come up with a great solution. Right?
Sure.
Maybe largely declarative, it might be code, but they'll find the right answer.
Yeah.
I think the type, when you're talking about architecture, you're kind of up a level from that, right? It's a much more ambiguous space. You're given a business problem, not a technical problem, and you've got to solve that. And how you solve that can change depending on what, it's not necessarily a Salesforce answer.
So it's often
not in all respects.
Yeah. So I mean, the way of thinking is quite important. Then not just knowing Salesforce, but it's how you kind of think more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, I really do think the best architects in the ecosystem are those that have some understanding, knowledge, and appreciation of things outside of Salesforce.
Sure.
I think it's a necessity.
Yeah.
I think it's something that I'm seeing more recently is something that's maybe ignored a little bit, and it's largely because I guess for the younger people, they haven't really come up through that whole having to deal with the on-premise world so much. But I encourage people that when they're going through that journey into architecture, that they actually do look wider than just Salesforce, because I think you need to, and especially if you're looking to pass something like the CTA.
Sure.
If all you know is the Salesforce content knowledge, you will not pass. I can guarantee that.
I remember you once told me you've got a law degree. I think you speak Japanese.
Yeah, not so well anymore, but yeah.
But it's still there. And the CTA was still the hardest thing you've ever done.
Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. Yes.
Okay.
Just to set expectations, that is absolutely the case.
Yeah,
yeah. Because it's very content rich. I mean, even back then and now, it's probably, if anything, it's harder in terms of that. I think accessing the content and training material, etc. That's way better these days to offset that. Yeah. But the breadth and depth that is expected of you is incredible. And that's just one side of it, right? So there's the approach to the board and managing your time and being able to solution on the fly. And so, there's some stuff there that you need to apply that is, you don't see the scenario beforehand.
Sure.
So
it's literally
you've got to be quite creative.
Sure.
And you've got to be ready, and you've got to be just really ruthless with how you answer it.
Sure.
And everything. So.
Sure. There was a question I wanted to ask that I've seen coming up more regularly, and it's often with an end user company and the hiring manager is from a technology background. So quite often a CTO, and they've come from an engineering background, and they're looking to build out a team of Salesforce developers, and their expectation of a Salesforce developer is far greater, I find, than a lot of the other companies we work with that don't have that engineering background. So they often don't see a Salesforce developer when they meet with them and talk with them as an engineer. They feel that the skills they have are a bit more fluffy and perhaps don't follow the engineering principles that other engineers do. What's your view on that?
Yeah, look, I think there's some validity to that, right? And I think part of that is, again, that as a consequence of now Salesforce being 20 years, I think it was 20 year mark.
Yeah.
As a consequence of that, people have spent their entire careers in Salesforce.
Sure.
And only in Salesforce. No, that's a great thing. I mean, Salesforce really well.
Right? Yeah.
But what that doesn't afford you is the opportunity to really understand some of the more broad, engineering concepts, development concepts. I think, will they be a great Apex coder? Yeah, probably. If they've spent all that time in Apex, they will probably be pretty good. But just more broadly, right, understanding the how things operate at different tiers of the infrastructure, when you're talking about it, the application space, memory usage and so on and so forth. And a lot of that stuff, there's not much of a level you have to worry about on Salesforce.
Sure.
A lot of it's kind of taken care of, and you kind of just code in accordance with government limits.
Sure.
But that is why there's that perception, I think. So once again, I think to be a really, really good developer, it's great to look at stuff that's more broad.
Yeah.
I think Lightning Web Components coming is going to give people that opportunity.
Sure.
Because it's more aligned to sort of industry standard development, and I think you're going to see a lot more of that wider appreciation and understanding.
So do you think some of those guys are going to be now more attracted to the Salesforce market? Some of the web developers out there
too, yeah.
Which can only be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, there's quite a bit of resistance, especially for the pure front end developers. They typically find the current platform a little bit too restrictive.
Sure.
I think the idea with Lightning Web Components is that it's much closer to, your CMS platforms, for example. So.
Okay, cool. So the hardest thing you've ever done, CTA, pretty much every architect that we speak to wants to get to that point. I'm not going to ask you your top three because it's putting you on the spot, but what's the best piece of advice you can give anyone that ever wants to become a CTA?
Look, it's tough. I mean, I think the preparation, I'll give you a couple because I can't really just give you one. I think the preparation is key. So practice. If anybody thinks that just because they have great content knowledge, they can pass that thing, they're wrong. It is all about practice. And I don't know anybody, including the most brilliant CTAs, who could have done that without practice.
Sure.
Right. So it's absolutely mandatory. So find yourself a coach or a mentor, or get into a program. There's now Salesforce will run formal introductory training courses for CTO, which is good. I think it's called 601. So absolutely practice. Practice. it's key. And leading up to it. No, you can't. You really can't. So that's number one. I think number two is actually what I said before, and that is you have to understand things wider than just Salesforce, because you will be dealing with problems that might involve, proxies, reverse proxies, network firewall. It could be anything.
Sure.
Identity. So when you're talking about SSO flows, you need to really know that stuff.
Yeah. And
you don't ever really know that stuff unless you've played with the other side of the equation.
Sure. Because we speak to a lot of people that get their application and system architect and they're like, right, ready.
Good to go.
Good to go, when do I book it in? Yeah. And every CTO I speak to is like, that's just not enough. Like that's the absolute minimum that says you're getting close to, one day being ready to sit that review board. It's not.
I agree.
It's not the be all and end all. So I think, that needs to be a message that more people hear, because everyone thinks that they're ready soon, and I think there's a lot more to it than just that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of that, right, is they do have that sort of time expectation in terms of experience. Now, they say a certain amount of Salesforce experience. I would actually change that a little bit, and I would say overall experience, right?
Sure.
So again, if you've got strong architectural experience from before you ever touched Salesforce, that's a huge advantage.
Yeah, which obviously
you need the Salesforce content knowledge, but you absolutely need the wider.
Because your CTA, in terms of years of experience in the Salesforce world, came relatively quickly.
Relatively, I've seen it done quicker.
Really?
Definitely, oh yes.
But then you were leaning on all of that prior Siebel architecture experience to get you across the line.
Yeah, 100%. So I think I had a number of advantages, right? So I came from very much a CRM and a data background, and it's quite heavy in terms of transitioning into Salesforce. Those skills are kind of required, but also just broader, and again having to deal with managing on-prem infrastructure and networks and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
In my past, certainly I think helped.
Sure.
Because your understanding of all of the other, the wider environment is already there.
Sure. So that leads us on nicely to the group and the event and the meetup that yourself and Richard and Ohas are running. which I believe is targeted just at architects.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the goal with that? What's the plan, and what are you looking to achieve?
Yeah, I guess, the first thing I'd say is, if you consider yourself to be an architect, absolutely come along, right?
Sure.
And there's a whole range. There are business architects, right down to nuts and bolts, technical solution.
Yeah.
So it's not we want to be as inclusive as possible, but it is really, it's out there because there was nothing in that space.
Mm-hmm.
So there are admin user groups, there are dev user groups. So
Trial Tuesday, don't forget
everything, yes, yeah, absolutely. So pretty much every category, but there was nothing really in the architecture space for Salesforce people. And Salesforce themselves have a very strong, within their services and advisory group, they have a very strong collaborative unit.
Sure.
And so people can sort of ask each other questions, use each other as a sounding board, get advice. I think oftentimes in the partner ecosystem, senior architects in particular find themselves a little bit alone, right?
Yeah.
To a degree. And
sure.
And so when they have a problem that perhaps nobody has ever really seen before, they can't really test that against anyone.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult.
Yeah.
And so the idea here is to kind of say, well, leave your badges at the door. It's not about who you work for.
Yeah.
It's literally, let's talk about issues that we see
mm-hmm.
every day, or perhaps raise something that you've seen that's new. Talk about new innovations. So we hear some of the stuff that we don't get the chance to necessarily in terms of platform development. We've got Salesforce's participation in the event, which is great. So it's really about that. So it's feeling that you're a bit of a community and a bit supported in that role, which I think everybody's really looking for. And clearly, the popularity of the first session indicates that it is something that was needed.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what the whole Salesforce market's about, right? Being collaborating, and I think from the feedback we've had, and everyone's excited about it. So I think it's going to be very, very popular, and hopefully we see more CTAs coming out of that.
It's part of the goal. Yeah, absolutely.
Good. So finally, if you were starting your Salesforce career again, day one, what would you do differently?
Well, that's a really good question. I would probably lose the fear. Right? I think that's the key thing. I think when I first started it, I was, it's all too new. It's the cloud and scary. And I think that's the people who do the best in this ecosystem are the ones that lose the fear.
Okay.
And something new comes and they're just into it straight away. Right?
Yeah, sure.
Let's try it out. Let's see how it works.
Yeah.
Quite often what I find is there are, and unfortunately I see it quite a lot, is that people, because they're so focused on sort of doing their day job, if they've learnt Salesforce and developed great visual force, coding techniques, right? When Lightning Components came along, they just weren't ready to really invest in learning new techniques. And so what you find is that if people aren't doing that, if they're not constantly reinvigorating their skills and experience, then you're getting stale answers to problems.
Sure.
And so I think there's part of that that's a fear thing. Like, I don't know that well. I've learnt this other thing, so I want to use this.
Sure.
So, and you get the same thing when people just resort to code every time, when there are so many more declarative techniques now, and you can actually use them.
Sure.
So I find that if you lose the fear, if you just something new, I want to learn about it, I want to skill up, I want to do it, then I think you stand yourself in pretty good stead to make a success of your career here.
Well, if you didn't have that attitude, you could still be a SQL guy.
That's 100%.
And that's a scary thing.
And to be honest, that was kind of some of the mindset that I was applying. So
sure,
glass houses and all of that. But I think I was in that camp.
Sure.
And I had to really force myself out of it.
Okay.
So forget what you knew for 10 years.
Yeah.
Start again.
Okay.
you're out of your comfort zone, 100%. But I think people need to get out of their comfort zone more often.
Sure.
It's 100% the way you need to be.
Yeah, for sure. And the evolution of the platform, you can't stay still.
You can't. You become irrelevant very quickly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. Absolute pleasure. And anyone in Melbourne, I really do recommend they get along. Anyone that's an architect or at that stage, recommend getting along to your events. And looking forward to seeing what comes out of it. So thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you.